After 7 months, the FBI says the January 6th Capitol attack was not coordinated. But will this change the media narrative? Welcome to America Uncovered. I'm Chris Chappell. It's been more than 7 months since this happened at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. And there's some big news. First, let me say, what happened inside the Capitol was a shame. It went too far, and people who broke the law should be held accountable. I'm not defending anyone's actions. This was the worst thing to happen to America in a January since Epic Movie. That being said, since this is America Uncovered, it's important to uncover what actually happened and what didn't, what we know and what we don't know, what reports are true and what's just political spin. And here's the latest. According to Reuters, the FBI hasn't found evidence the U.S. Capitol attack was coordinated. I get it, it wasn't well organized. That was obvious to anyone watching the video. It looks like the most poorly thought out flash mob in history. So why is what the FBI said such a big deal? Well, it's a big deal because it flies in the face of some of the narratives that have been coming out in the media and by certain politicians. Narratives that began as soon as the evening of January 6th. A number of politicians began insisting what happened at the Capitol that day was an organized attempt to overthrow the United States government. Not so sure how organized it was, though, since clearly almost no one got the memo on the all-fur dress code. Come on, you guys. Politicians were looking for a very specific legal charge, seditious conspiracy, also known as sedition. They put a lot of political pressure on agencies assigned to investigate the Capitol breach. That might be why, on January 12th, a mere 5 days after the investigation had begun, Federal prosecutor Michael Sherwin said this.
The FBI, working with the U.S. Attorney's offices across the country, and the crux of those being in D.C., we're looking at significant felony cases tied to sedition and conspiracy. Just yesterday, our office organized a strike force of very senior national security prosecutors and public corruption prosecutors. Their only marching orders from me are to build seditious and conspiracy charges related to the most heinous acts that occurred in the Capitol.
That might also be why on January 26th, the assistant director in charge of the Washington FBI field office said, "We are closely looking at evidence related to the sedition charges. We're working on those cases, and I think those results will bear fruit very soon." Is it just me, or does it sound like they're specifically looking for sedition charges, rather than following the trail of evidence? They reached a conclusion and are now working backwards to try and justify it. Kind of like how I assume that every one of these Capitol rioters is named Daryl. I don't know how I know, I just know. There have also been a lot of questions about the treatment of the January 6 suspects in custody. Allegations they've gotten harsher treatment than BLM rioters. And even though most of the January 6 cases haven't gone to court yet, the Department of Justice maintains a publicly searchable database that details every single case, including the names of each suspect, which absolutely proved my Daryl theory. I knew it! In March, federal prosecutor Michael Sherwin went on 60 Minutes and defended his January statement.
The world looks to us for the rule of law and order and democracy, and that was shattered, I think, on that day, and we have to build ourselves up again. The only way to build ourselves up again is the equal application of the law to show the rule of law is going to treat these people fairly under the law.
The world doesn't look to America for law and order. They look to us for ways to add hot dogs to places they don't belong. But given the statements from federal prosecutors, some people didn't feel reassured that the equal application of the law is still the American way. Enter the latest from the FBI, right after the break. Welcome back. Despite political pressure from powerful members of Congress, Sources in the FBI are now saying they don't have much evidence the January 6th event was coordinated, which means they probably don't have enough evidence to call it a seditious conspiracy. Wait, you mean to tell me the guy who urinated in Nancy Pelosi's office wasn't part of some grand master plan? I thought every traitorous insurrection was inspired by Calvin bumper stickers. In any case, no seditious conspiracy charges have emerged so far. Why is the FBI not pursuing sedition charges now? It all comes down to the legal definition of seditious conspiracy. In legal terms, seditious conspiracy occurs in two instances. One, it occurs if two or more persons in any state conspire to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force the government of the United States, or to oppose by force the authority thereof. And two, it occurs if two or more persons conspire by force to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law of the United States. Wait, you only need two people for seditious conspiracy. How does it take fewer people to try and overthrow the government than it does to play a game of Clue? No one's seriously arguing that the January 6th rioters were trying to actually overthrow the government of the United States. Well, maybe not no one. Still, most people discussing the legal charge of seditious conspiracy are talking about the second definition of the term, a conspiracy to prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of the law. In this case, the execution of the law would be the official certification of the Electoral College count. But in order to make a case for seditious conspiracy, prosecutors have to prove intent and the existence of a concrete agreement among participants. According to Reuters, the FBI says participants had no concrete agreement, let alone any actual plan to hinder the execution of a law. I am shocked these folks didn't have a plan. According to one source, 90 to 95% of these are one-off cases. Then you have 5% maybe of these militia groups that were more closely organized, but there was no grand scheme with Roger Stone and Alex Jones and all of these people to storm the Capitol and take hostages. Well, I guess that's the end of the investigation into Roger Stone and Alex Jones. Over this, I mean. They're still investigating whether or not Roger Stone and Alex Jones are actually Judge Doom and the Thing. Even among the small number of militia groups that were more closely organized, Reuters sources said FBI investigators did find that cells of protesters had aimed to break into the Capitol, but they found no evidence that the groups had serious plans about what to do if they made it inside. Again, I'm shocked these guys didn't have a plan. And no concrete plan equals no seditious conspiracy. And anyway, it's hard to convict people of seditious conspiracy because there's such a high burden of proof. So seditious conspiracy charges are likely off the table, which may be disappointing to certain politicians, but it's reassuring to folks who worried the DOJ and the FBI would not pursue the investigation fairly. So the sedition narrative doesn't hold up. But there are plenty of other narratives left. More on that after the break. Welcome back. So the FBI's discovery that the January 6th Capitol breach wasn't coordinated, it blows a huge hole in the sedition narrative. But what about other buzzwords used by politicians and the media to describe it? Some have called it a coup. Others have called it an insurrection. And one handsome devil called it the most poorly thought out flash mob in history. With this new information, will those terms still fly? Well, technically it was never really a coup because neither Trump nor the military were involved. Though this guy does look like he was dishonorably discharged from the KISS army. Even the woman who wrote the book on coups said it wasn't a coup. She said it was an insurrection. But was it really an insurrection? With this new information from the FBI, that term might no longer hold up either. Insurrection is charged by federal prosecutors far more rarely than sedition. And legal experts have said insurrection is almost impossible to prove in court. Okay, well what about domestic terrorism? Is that still available? The FBI director called it that back in March. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack labels it a domestic terrorist attack. Will that have to change too? I hope so. A guy once attempted to use a shoe bomb on a plane, and now we all have to take off our shoes at airport security. If these guys are labeled domestic terrorists, I might have to remove my fur hat every time I enter a government building. This is my mailing letters hat, dang it! So let's look at the definition of domestic terrorism. Legally, it's activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of criminal laws, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and of course occur primarily within the United States. So in short, to be domestic terrorism, it has to at least endanger human lives, violate U.S. law, and be intended to intimidate or coerce. Meaning that, like with sedition, a prosecutor referencing domestic terrorism would need to prove intent to intimidate, coerce, or influence the government or people of the United States. This is why acts of terrorism are usually accompanied with specific demands of some sort, generally political in nature. The Capitol breach did not. There were no demands. There were lots of people in MAGA gear standing around looking confused. Basically the same thing you'd see at a Kid Rock concert. But there were no specific demands. The Reuters report indicates most people involved didn't really have a plan for what they were going to do, or even a concrete sense of what they wanted, other than to breach the Capitol and demonstrate their frustration. This, not planned. This guy really misunderstood what everyone around him meant when they said, "We need to take a stand." So that's a bit of a stretch to keep pushing the domestic terrorist attack label. What about domestic violent extremism? That term also showed up in the webpage for the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Will that term still work? We'll look into it after this final break. Welcome back. Or not, since we're talking about the January 6th Capitol riot. It's a touchy subject for YouTube. Most of the terms used to describe the Capitol breach in the aftermath have been called into question by this new report from FBI sources. Terms like sedition, coup, insurrection, and even domestic terrorist attack are looking less and less accurate. I haven't seen someone so bad at naming something since Elon Musk. But what about domestic violent extremism? As Shakespeare once said, "A rose by any other name may finally start getting some convictions and further the narrative." The Biden administration has used the January 6th event as a starting point to go after what they're calling domestic violent extremists. They've released this new national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. In the report, domestic terrorism was specifically tied to violent extremists, including those who are racially motivated or anti-government. There's even an entire section on assessment of the domestic violent extremism threat. And right up there on the list of domestic terrorist attacks by violent extremists is the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing that killed 168 people, and the 2016 Dallas shooting where a guy shot and killed 5 cops. But following in the same paragraph is this. And just months ago, Americans witnessed an unprecedented attack against a core institution of our democracy, the U.S. Congress. 4 protesters died at the U.S. Capitol that day. 1 from a heart attack, 1 from a stroke, 1 from an accident, and 1 from being shot by the police. And a police officer died from exhaustion later that day. But none of those were murder. I feel like that doesn't go in the same paragraph as the Oklahoma City bombing. It doesn't even go in the same paragraph as that hot dog crust pizza. Way more Americans die as a result of this. Heart disease is the leading cause of death in the U.S. And a protest that involves people occupying Congress is not really unprecedented. Here are some DACA protesters unlawfully occupying the U.S. Capitol in 2018. Here are some Green New Deal protesters occupying Pelosi's office also in 2018. Here's a group of Black Panthers carrying loaded firearms in the California State Capitol in 1967. And here's the mutant Nightcrawler teleporting into the White House in 2003. Turns out Americans have a strong tradition of protesting inside Capitol buildings. Although the DACA and Green New Deal protests were not the same as the January 6th riot, those were nonviolent protests done by people who were allowed in the building. On January 6th, people broke into the Capitol building. Some smashed glass doors. Others clashed violently with police. That doesn't make it domestic terrorism, but the Biden administration is arguing that it's domestic violent extremism. The Biden administration's document later states that newer socio-political developments, such as narratives of fraud in the recent general election, the emboldening impact of the violent breach of the U.S. Capitol, will almost certainly spur some domestic violent extremists to try and engage in violence this year. And the Capitol event may have been used as an excuse for the Biden administration's purge of so-called extremism in the military, since some of the people there on January 6th were veterans. Although Biden's main focus involving the military and extremism should have been not giving Afghanistan to the Taliban. And hey, remember how the government used 9/11, which was legitimately a tragedy, to justify the Patriot Act that's been used to spy on Americans for the last 20 years? I'm sure the government would never use domestic violent extremism to do something similar. Anyway, maybe this new report from the FBI will put a wrench in it. After all, if the extremists are dangerous because they might perpetrate domestic terrorism, and the definition of domestic terrorism requires some kind of plan, and the Capitol breach wasn't planned, then it kind of hurts the narrative that the Capitol breach was a plot by domestic violent extremists, which in turn kind of pulls the rug out from under the extremist hunt. If the FBI sources for Reuters are correct, it's starting to look more like the Capitol breach was merely a riot and not an organized insurrection. Ha! Merely a riot. We've seen our share of riots in the last year or two. I think America can handle those. I guess they just need to come up with yet another name for it. I vote for poorly thought out flashmob. Besides, all sides can agree we definitely need to put a stop to those. So what do you think? Will any of the narratives relating to January 6th change in the wake of this Reuters exclusive? Let us know in the comments. And remember, America Uncovered is supported mainly by viewers like you. So head on over to our Patreon page, contribute $1 or more per episode, so we can keep making content like this for you. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. Thanks for watching America Uncovered.